My name is Stephen Erlanger. I'm the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And it's a great pleasure to be back here again. Thanks to organizers, sponsors, everybody else. We have about 40 minutes for an enormous topic, so we'll do the best we can. Mr. O'Leary just described at some length the workings of a country of 5 million people. We're talking about a continent of 1.2 billion people, at least, probably more. A continent that's very diverse. We call it Africa, but it's 100 different places and probably several thousand different languages. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about how the young people of Africa, which was perhaps 60% of the population's under 30, which is enormous, and vibrant and better educated, et cetera, how they will decide to rule themselves. I mean, which is really the question of democracy. And with us, we have 3 people who are deeply engaged in this process. Unfortunately, Ibioka Fabaroda couldn't be with us because of travel problems, but we have Caroline Gaita, who's executive editor of the Mzalendo Trust in Kenya, which looks at parliaments and tries to keep a transparent eye on what they're doing, which I think is a crucial part of democracy, which is public interest, public observation, public check of politicians. We have Adama Sanneh, who's CEO and co-founder of the Moleskine Foundation, which does a lot with education, creativity, working with youth, and based in where?
Based in Milan.
In Milan, okay, fine, good.
But hardly there.
Yeah, exactly. And then filling in very gently and generously is Namatai Kwekweza, if I get this right, who runs the WELEAD Trust in Zimbabwe, which again is encouraging young Africans to get involved with politics, to take on leadership. So the first thing I just want to ask you, we'll just start with you, Caroline.
Yes.
I mean, given the enormity of the continent, it's a little bit méchant, naughty of me, but what are the generalizations about Africa that annoy you the most?
He had promised that would come at the end, but thank you, Stephen, and really happy to be here. One is that, and you have said it, we are not one country. We are 54 countries, and with 2 countries whose independence is contentious, that's Somaliland and the Sahel. So 56 countries in total. We are diverse, different languages, different cultures, different religions, different political systems. And so even as we discuss democracy, it's very interesting, especially following up from the conversation last night on civilization, that our democracy is defined differently within the 54 countries. Yes.
Could you talk a bit more about that? Because I think that's really important. I mean, democracy, there are lots of ways of interpreting it. It's changed over time.
Yes.
I mean, we talk, President Biden talks about democracies and authoritarian states, which seems to divide the world much too simply. So talk a little bit about what you know best, perhaps your own country, and what are the models for the rest of Africa, you think?
So I'm from Kenya, and Kenya really has been one of the bastions of hope, despite some challenges we've had in the past. We are a country that has respected term limits. We are a country that has a progressive constitution that talks about the inclusion of women and youth. Whether that's achievable or has been achieved is a bit debatable. But again, when you look at the 54 countries that I've talked about, the diversity, you have presidents who've been in power for 40 years plus. You have others who've been in power for 38 years plus that have been removed in military coups recently. And still you have others like ours, and quite a number of them, that respect term limits, that serve 10 years and move on, that respect elections, that are working to promote transparency in elections through the use of technology. But you have others also that have pretentious elections where, elections take place, but they are rigged from the start to the finish. So it's really
Not just in
a mixed
Africa.
bag, right? But it's really a mixed bag of, exclusion, of inclusion, of diversity or lack of it. You have countries where women are leading. Rwanda is an example of a country that, despite its past challenges, has the highest number of women parliamentarians across the world. And yet you have others that, despite quotas, women still have no voice. Young people have no voice. And so perhaps to then look at the current issues that are emerging, military coups, is to ask ourselves, why do we suddenly have an increase in this? And you'll be surprised to know that, and perhaps we'll come to that, that there are other emerging issues, around how democracy is working for African citizens and what democracy actors need to do to make sure that the democracy dividend really means what it should for the African continent.
That's a wonderful start, thank you. Adama, what drives you mad about the popular conversation about your continent?
The 40 minutes
How much
that we
time
have
do I have?
can actually go on this. Look, there are many, and also being mixed, because my father was from Senegal and the Gambia, my mom is Italian, so I have the two perspectives growing up. It hit me in different ways. So on one side, absolutely, the reduction of the African continent of one single story, it's always astonishing, even in 2023, it's incredible how poor the language is when we talk about the continent. And one of the crazy thing, and I use this word, is that you have incredible minds, especially from the West, that are some of the most articulated people, when they're dealing in their own field. And the moment that they're talking about the African continent is almost like their intelligence shut down and they become like, just a spore of prejudice and stereotypes. And I found it quite incredible because I'm always trying to wonder, what is that mechanism that happened in the mind of people at times? And sometimes, I even use this word, that arrogance that makes you feel that you are at the center of the world.
Do you think it stems from colonialism to begin with? Or, and then just to push you further, just on the question of democratization, is there any feeling that this too is an importation from old colonial powers?
Absolutely. The question of deconstructing the colonial, I would say, infrastructure, especially, well, not only, but I would say especially culturally, is extremely a hard task because the African continent is a space that has always been like somebody else's object. Right. Even yesterday, sometimes, and I'm saying it in a constructive way, but just the language that is used, is to say, the African continent is a geopolitical hub. All right, that is true, but in the language, intrinsically, there is in Italian we say depauperation. They take out, the subjectivity of the people of the continent, right. And that continues. Sometimes it's subtle, subtle language that still impose, that gaze on the continent, right. And it's extremely hard to shake it out. There is a poet, the former poet laureate from South Africa, who was in a sentence in his poetry saying, the father before my father knew the uses of fire, in a sense that time didn't start
yes, exactly.
when colonialism started. And that, I think, is an important lesson that I hope everybody can only keep, not only in their mind, but in their heart.
Right. So also very helpful. Namatai, you've I don't know how old you are, but you're a big Kofi Annan Prize winner. You're working with young people. You're trying to get them to lead. You're a generation that grew up, in a sense, post-colonial. Does that make a big difference?
Okay, so thank you very much. And just to answer your question, I am 24 years old this year. I think just a major reflection, and I absolutely agree with what he is saying, is that, when we look at, Africa, and particularly I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I was born in 1998, and 1997 really was the peak of things going downhill. So I've never seen a functional society where, there's like proper, sanitation, there's like just basic things that are essential in terms of human rights. And I think the critical conversation for me as an activist has always been, when we are putting pressure on the government and we are demanding that they deliver, they have often retorted to this position where they blame it all on the West. And they say, oh, the West gave us sanctions and we are part of a very ugly geopolitical infrastructure, be it financially, be it politically. And at some point, it almost felt as if it was rhetoric on their part, because there is a lot of corruption. No one can deny that COVID-19 funds were looted. No one can deny the state of dilapidation in our hospitals. No one can deny the issues around the lack of freedom of expression. We've got people that have been in jail, pre-trial detention, sometimes for over a year, which is absolutely absurd considering that we've got the 2013 Constitution. But when you do listen to some of the arguments that some of these leaders are presenting, it is true. And I think that for us as African citizens, and particularly as a young African, we are basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. Yeah. Governments, true to say, must be held accountable. There is corruption, and we demand that accountability that is also indirectly filled to a violation of our rights. If there is corruption in the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health, it means that you will not deliver on the promise of education. You will not deliver on the promise of health. But also, if the global financial architecture, and by the way, it is strongly hinged on a lot of historical injustices, is tilted and skewed in favor of certain races, it is biased, and particularly from the premise of race and the premise of gender, very patriarchal. It often means that certain countries, particularly in the global south, but also in Africa, will underperform, and therefore they cannot deliver on the promise of democracy. So the idea is not to blame and point fingers. It's not to say they are wrong, we are right. It's actually to have a critical reflection around where do we bear the responsibility as locals within Africa, but also as the international system.
Just to press you for a second, there's a legacy of history. In other words, quite a lot of these leaders now were the fighters against colonialism. They won the wars of independence. You see this in South Africa also. There's a claim to leadership from the past, which somehow is used to excuse lots of problems in the present. Does your generation find that a particular burden, or how do you deal with that?
Okay, so that's a very great question. And what I will say is that the entitlement is real. The fact that we are the liberators, we fought to free the country, etc. But I think for me, and I always tell people this, that I'm Pan-African, I'm unapologetically Pan-African, and the ideology of Pan-Africanism, which subsequently was one of the fueling drives of the wars of liberation that swept the continent, is the idea that is centralized in the concept of human dignity. It is the dignity of the African. If you are liberators and you went to war to ensure that the African would get equal status, the African would be healthy, the African would be fed, the African would have education, the African would have access to opportunity, to dream, to be, to live like any other person in any other civilization. The African deserves the dignity of being recognized as a human being. And you are directly or indirectly participating in creating architecture and infrastructure and systems that inadvertently lead to the misery and suffering of an African, then you have absolutely no legitimacy to say that because I did XYZ 40 years ago, I now have the right to abuse people and to do whatever I want. The promise of the Pan-African dream must be delivered in our lifetime. And if it means that we must continue the struggle to actually find our dignity, to have health, to have education, we young people will continue to fight. And this is exactly the tension between older generations and younger generations.
Yeah, because one of the things that is simply true about democracy, let's put it that way. It's a struggle. It's not a steady state, right? I mean, there's always institutions, interests, people who want to subvert it, who want to use it to their own ends. So watching over it, I think, is a key part of keeping it alive. You, Caroline, you brought up something that I think would be interesting to all of us, which was suddenly you see in the Sahel like 6 coups in a row, which seems to cut against what we would love to talk about, which is increasing democratization. Is this just the end of France-Afrique? How do you interpret this? And is it temporary, or is it something different? Is it a function of a growing sense among leaders in the world that they can get away with this stuff?
Okay. First, let me start from the positive news. A recent study by Afrobarometer on the state of democracy in Africa actually shows that about 67 to 70% of Africans support democracy in all its totality. And so for us, democracy is a system that works and must continue to work for the continent. Having said that, the same research does show that out of the 67%, about 36% of those that support democracy, 36 to 46% are not satisfied, unsatisfied with how democracy is working. And I think therein is the biggest challenge for democracy in Africa, that democracy is not, as much as it has global support from the continent, does not seem to be working for the citizens. And so the citizens are then saying, look, we want democracy to work. In addition, there's a certain, still in the same research, about 36% of the citizens that were interviewed felt that if their leadership is not working, never mind they've been democratically elected, they support military intervention in certain ways, which is not a good sign for the continent. So we posit then that the biggest challenge to democracy is not so much the military rulers that are overthrowing governments, but actually the democratically elected leaders that are not working for their people. What Namatai talks about, the attachment to the past, the attachment to the corruption, the insecurity, the living cost of, the rising cost of living. And so for democracy to work, we really must define and begin to ask ourselves how it's paying for the citizens. We must make sure that even as we speak about leaving no one behind, then we are carrying, especially the young people, these statistics that I'm talking about, support, and part of it could be nostalgic. They've not seen the negative consequences of military interventions. So it's something that we must address. I do not think that it's a wave that's likely to last, because as I'm saying, we as Africans support democracy, we support rule of law, we support democratically elected leaders. It's just bridging the gap. And to just add to one thing she has talked about, you've talked about the colonial hang-ups. Kenya is one of our current administration, our current president and his government is a post-independence president. He's the first generation of a president born after independence. Our average parliamentary age is made up of people who were born after independence. And if you looked at our elections, actually the campaign was between the past and the future, that it's time for young people to take it forward. But what does this inclusion of young people mean in spaces where they are not in decision-making rooms? The cost of politics is driving them out of running for office. Campaign promises are not kept, and therefore they feel excluded. So democracy must be made to work for the continent, and leaders who are democratically elected must be held to account so that then they don't negate and they don't soil the good work of, or the good support, the 67% of Africans that support democracy are not disillusioned to thinking that it's not the best option, and yet it must continue to be the best option.
No, that's good, because I mean, one of the great challenges, in America too, in Europe, is the democratic system actually delivering as much as it used to deliver? And is it delivering the right things for the right people, or is inequality growing everywhere? I mean, and so this is a kind of general problem, I think. Adama, what do you think? I mean, is this wave of coups a sort of temporary response to something, or do you see it as more an augury of the future?
Well, so to me, the premise starts again with what is our capacity to hold complex conversation about the African continent, because more truth can hold together. What has been said is extremely right, is extremely correct. The description between younger generation and older generation, I think it was on point. All of those things hold together. Like, our fathers that fought for independence did something extraordinary. Extraordinary. At the same time, some of the people that are in power, are betraying that original cause. And there is a young generation who fighting to something else. At the same time, the point of the single story narrative is not, or the single narrative is not only a problem the continent face. The problem is that the continent, the African continent, is challenging even the propaganda and the stories of the West. It doesn't hold on necessarily. Again, the history doesn't start when the West decides to start. So when we see some of these coups, that are very much apparently, against some principle of democracy, et cetera, but we cannot ignore that they're coming from existing injustices. It's some of the people think they're at war. They're at war because there are specific reasons. Chad is a great example. And that relation between Chad and France is an important example. Now, I don't want again to reduce, because that's the issue. I don't want again to reduce everything to the thing like, no, it's the West, and like it's not. The point is that how can we get out of this dichotomic view of the world, and how can we hold the complexity? Yesterday we were talking about how so I think that we are in the era of creativity, all right, of creativity.
Right.
We moved from the era of information, where everything was about access to information, to the knowledge society, where the point of information was how do you transform it into knowledge. Now we know that whatever we knew yesterday is obsolete tomorrow. So now the question is, how can we use knowledge in a dynamic way? And this is particularly important in the space of democracy. I strongly believe that we live in a polycrisis moment, but the deepest crisis that we live is a crisis of language. It's such a difficulty, to build the language to describe the multiple experiences, the multiple voices that are happening in the world. And the cost of having still the African continent at the periphery, with all its complexity, at the periphery of this discussion, it's enormous. We look at yesterday, and there was a little bit of irony around, what are the other way of democracy? Well, have you ever heard about the Truth and Reconciliation Council? Have you ever heard how societies, communities manage to go beyond the traditional way, a sense of justice, by reconstructing a sense of community? Have you ever heard the word Ubuntu? Of course, that all of you would know that that remained famous, in the West in the 90s because of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, that basically saying, I am because you are. And it completely takes us away from that dichotomic, view of, I and the other. That would help to have this concept like this in our language. And this is not just, some ancestral, narrative. Ubuntu is a concept that exists in the South African Constitution. Mm-hmm. It's a legal term. Mm-hmm. It shaped the institution. We really don't have anything, I'm going to say we in this case, I take my Western side, we really don't have anything to learn there. We're facing the crisis of migrants.
Right.
All right? Again, is a crisis of language, because the language that we have now, it put us in a dichotomic view of the world. There's a word in Senegal that is called teranga. A teranga is a deep sense of welcoming. It's not just, oh, you're welcome. It's a deeper sense, it's a deeper value. If we'll be able to embrace and stay with that language, well, maybe some new thoughts would emerge. And this not only from the African continent, but I think it goes away with all the minorities, and knowledge that is out there, and language stays at the center of it. Maybe you will remember, in one of the first documentaries that start denouncing the issue of climate change was this very difficult title that was called Koyana Skatsi. And it was like the first documentary with Philip Glass music. It became very famous and so on and so forth. But Koyana Skatsi is a word that is of the Opi people, in Native American. And the word literally means world out of balance, being out of balance. So there is language out there that can help us to reformulate our mission and to help us to make everything more complex so that we can overcome the crisis of meaning that we're living now.
Yes, well, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Because I always think, the world's always in a poly-crisis in one place or another. I don't think it's ever been quiet and peaceful and stable. I mean, how many wars are there going on right now in the world? Probably 50, and yet we concentrate in the West basically on one of them right now.
But I think you're absolutely right. I think the thing that changed is that now we're not only in a poly-crisis world, we are in a multi-voices world.
Yes, which in a way is more democratic, it's better, more confusing maybe, harder to keep control of. And that's why I wanted to come to you, Namatai. And also, when we get there, I'd love to have a couple questions. So if you're thinking of them, please think of some questions now. When we talk about, you're working, trying to get young people into leadership positions, into politics. Is it easier now to do it in a world that's this chaotic, or is kind of, in some ways, polarized by social media, by different passions that, before maybe you didn't hear so much about, or does it make it easier?
So thanks very much for the question. And I think as I respond to that particular question, it's also very much important to reflect on the prior question, because I think there's just a very strong linkage. When you talk about countries, especially in the Sahel, you talk about Niger, you talk about Burkina Faso, you talk about Mali, Gabon, all of these countries, I think we cannot neglect to have a critical conversation around the persistent foreign interference in African affairs, which then also affects young people, how they participate, how they show up, and whether or not they will be represented or heard. We are democracy actors in Africa as young people. We believe in democracy, but persistently, if you listen to the conversations happening to the youth in Niger, which sometimes can deceptively make the world assume that they're supporting military coups, in which case they are not. These are conversations around self-determination. These are conversations around decolonization, around reimagining a future for Africa where Africans are treated as persons with equal dignity. And fundamentally, I think they are justified in demanding that for themselves, because they deserve the dignity that a white European youth has. They deserve the dignity that an Indian youth has. They deserve the dignity like human beings, because they are people too. But then you also have the encroachment of certain nations that are also capitalizing on the situation. You've got China, you've got Russia, maliciously seeing the opportunity, spreading decolonization propaganda when they themselves are also on a recolonization mission. And we are stuck, like I said, between a rock and a hard place. So what does it actually mean to a youth who wants to participate, who wants to build democracy? It means that most of these colonial powers, because their hegemony is centered around leaders who have a tight grip on power, who want to stay in power, all of these voices are excluded literally from the conversation. And the exclusion of young people on the African continent is very much systemic. It's also very much structural. And I will end this particular conversation by saying that when you look at the percentage representation, Zimbabwe had an election this year. And we know for certainty that to this date, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has not produced statistics on the number of young people in public office. We actually wrote to them requesting that they produce them because they do not see young people as a priority. We know that in Parliament today, only one young person, one woman in particular, was elected, and then there are a few other young men who were elected into Parliament. Very few, and they do not constitute more than 3% of the overall representation. And this is the trend across the continent. And we had to ask ourselves, why is this the case? And our inadvertent realization is that there is a systemic and structural a construct around how to exclude young people. Fundamentally, it is hinged on the entitlement that we talked about earlier. We liberated you, we will rule. But also it is hinged on creating this political dynasties, as is the case with Zimbabwe, where now the president has appointed his family members as deputy ministers and ministers. And it's absolutely shameful. And these are his children, some of them are young. But then again, it's absolutely shameful because you've got a population of about 15 million people. I'm absolutely certain that if you use systems that are more liberal, systems that are open and fair and transparent, there are so many competent young people across the country who can assume that particular leadership role. So I think I'll stop here for now.
No, thank you. And of course, you've brought up a topic I almost didn't want to touch because it's so complicated and we had other things to talk about, which is, you know, disinformation and the role of China, Russia, and how African nations are responding to this effort to create a kind of anti-US dollar, anti-US sanction grouping. I mean, that's how I interpret the BRICS, really.
Just super quickly on that.
Yeah, please.
No, it's just to say that, because yesterday I think it came out, and more African presidents, in the right way and the way, they're using it, and the world is non-alignment. So we look in the 50s, we look at the Bandung Conference.
We've heard that before.
We look at, exactly. So again, something that then by the West is right away considered as like anti-US or anti-Russia. Sometimes it's just a statement of subjectivity and independence. Yeah. And the statement is, well, in some cases we decide to take a non-alignment, position on this.
I think that's a sensible position to take.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In our case, we're actually talking about multi-alignment because we have not defined ourselves as one way or the other. And there are a number of countries that are not aligned either way, that are not aligned to BRICS fully and are not supporting the de-dollarization campaign fully. But having said that, the whole concept of misinformation, disinformation, impact on elections, impact on perceptions, it's not peculiar to Africa. No. Perhaps what we are defining as our challenges is what you in Europe and in America you are defining as inward-looking nationalistic tendencies that are affecting how perception of other people in other continents are perceived. And in terms of the China influence, for example, because that's something that you had mentioned, the most important thing to perhaps focus on is how citizens perceive that aid. Yes. And now you're seeing a lot of discontent, not with China per se, but because of the public debt implications.
Yes, exactly.
So we've talked about roads and belt infrastructure development, but citizens are saying, hey, wait a minute, you've given us the roads, you've given us the infrastructure, but where is the food? Why is our tax going up? And those are the conversations that we need to be focusing on, yes. That it is looking east at what cost, looking west at what cost, and what is in it for the African. And perhaps before I conclude, we started by saying the future is African. It would be good to define what this African looks like. This African is educated. This African has access to technology. This African was born in Namatai's age. Namatai has not known a life without a mobile phone, without technology of some sort. And so they have a global view. They know what's happening here. They also know what's happening in the continent. Yes. They know what's fair. They know what's not fair. And so for us, it's not to silo the perception. It's not to silo, to look in a silo the challenges that are facing Africa, but to put Africa as, when we speak geopolitically, it's to put Africa on the global map and ask ourselves what this future Africa, and if it's going to be the largest continent, if it's going to have the highest population, how do we play a critical role? How do we inform? How do we invent? How do we innovate? How do we restruct? How do we reimagine? And how do we dare hope and create hope for the next generation?
That's great. Yeah. We are, of course, running out of time, but I'd love to take a couple questions. Do we have one of our young leaders who has their hand up? This woman in the back with her hand really high. Yes, you. Go ahead. If we have a microphone, yeah. Yeah, just project. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And also tell us who you are, if you don't mind.
Okay, so my name is Kwekweza Sifi. I'm Moroccan, coming from a background of international relations at Al Akhawan University in Ifran. I'm truly, honestly, it's so great to see people coming from different backgrounds, but especially as a Moroccan, it's good to see you talk and think and bring your ideas into light. First of all, one of the I'm going to comment on the women representation. Rwanda, for example, has suffered from the weaponization of rape during the genocide that happened a long time ago. And the quota system helped the representation of women, but one of the many critiques is it doesn't really represent the poor women because it's being used as a homogeneous term, loaded term. You spoke about language. So just to be mindful of the language and the representation that it holds, of course. And I would like to also ask a question about how do you imagine security in Africa? You talked about coup d'etats, but African country, as a loaded term again, has been bleeding for so many years. I'm gonna focus on mercenaries.
I mean, just make it a question and then let someone else ask the question.
Okay. Academy, DYN Corp, some of the private military companies that challenge sovereignty in Africa. A lot of African governments outsource their military. How do you perceive that?
Thank you very, very much. Can I have another question, please? This I can't really see, but the lady, yes, you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Calypso from EUI and the Democratic Odyssey. And I loved everything you all said. And as a European, I would like to even push you one radical step further in post-colonial thinking, at least for us, and hear what you think. To me, we still have Europeans and Westerners going around Africa promoting democracy, democracy promotion. Lots of money, still big industry. Yeah. I would argue that we need to reverse the democratic gaze and ask you to come to Europe and say what we can learn from the practices of democracy in a very broad sense from the African continent. Successes and failures, you come and you tell us.
Great, good idea. One more if I can. This gentleman who's right near you. Yes, sir. That's fine. Right there. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Georgios Jarvas.
I can't see him.
Entrepreneur and responsible for geopolitics and world economy. The question, I'm missing one word, the whole discussion yesterday and the last years. The magical word is respect. The question to you is, are you feeling respected from the rest of the world as African countries? And maybe this should be the next forum. We have to respect each other in our communication.
Thank you. And then which? Okay. Yes, the gentleman in the fez. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to salute the organizer of this program. My name is Darlington Mwokocha. I'm from Nigeria, the Senate.
Thank you.
And I would have loved to contribute on this seriously because I practice politics in Nigeria and in Africa. I've toured around Africa and some of the other international areas as well to say what really is happening in Nigeria, because Nigeria is one of the biggest countries in Africa. Sincerely, I want to ask whether democracy can operate independent of wealth distribution. Because to a very great extent, the interest lies on distribution of wealth. And this distribution of wealth is hinged primarily and extensively by external influence. I have listened to all the postulations since yesterday and therefore yesterday here, what we have been saying, how it can work well in Europe. That means totally they are all the same. As a lawmaker, we have all the fiscal responsibility bill, we have all the things that have to do with rule of law, but in application and enforcement, how do I achieve that when the leadership, when the arrowhead, if I may borrow your word, that is the president and the executive, are being introduced into a system by external influence? And what you have today in Niger, for instance, is a reaction not on the coup, military coup. No person wants any coup, military coup in Africa, but we are reacting against economic coup. If we do not understand that as an economic coup, where some people now find themselves somewhere now dividing the African countries to their interest. Well, where will I get the oil? Where will I get the gold? Where will I get that? And at the end of the day, the youths are reacting because there is digital transformation presently. And this digital transformation has given us the opportunity to say, we do not want this, therefore let's make it public. So I think we need more pressure group like this kind of association or group or forum that can espouse and expose what is happening in Africa extensively.
Thank you, sir, very, very much. Now, I've let this run way over time, so I'm not actually going to come back to the panel because what we've had is more comments than questions, and I'm glad to have heard them, and I'm glad everyone else has heard them. But please talk to the panelists during the day, and I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your questions then. So please, a round of applause to